Hey everyone. So, we hear all the time about how migrant children can struggle in school, right? It's pretty much a global pattern. But what if I told you that in the country with the second largest migrant population in the entire world, that pattern just vanishes? We're going to dig into the mystery of what's happening inside Russia's schools.
Okay, quick pop quiz. Which country has the most international migrants? That's easy. It's the US. But who's number two? You might think Germany, maybe the UK, but nope, it's Russia. They are home to the second largest migrant population on the planet. And that sheer scale is exactly what makes their school system so important to understand.
And that leads us right to the big question. When you have millions of migrant families, you would just assume there's going to be an achievement gap in the schools, right? Between kids who are migrants and kids who are native born. I mean, common sense says there has to be. But is common sense right on this one? To really get why this is such a mystery, we have to look at the global picture first. See, there's this widely accepted theory that explains why migrant students so often seem to have a harder time academically. It's called the assimilation hypothesis, and the idea is pretty straightforward. Moving to a whole new country is, well, incredibly tough. You can lose your friends, your social network, you might not speak the language, and your family often has to start from a lower economic rung on the ladder. All of that stress, the theory predicts, should lead to lower grades. And look, this is not just some idea someone cooked up, it's a proven pattern. The evidence for this gap is just overwhelming. We're talking studies from the United States, the UK, Germany, Spain, you name it. We even see it in places like China and Turkey with huge internal migration. So the expectation is totally set. Migration seems to equal an academic disadvantage. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast. There's actually a competing theory called the immigrant paradox hypothesis, and it completely flips the script. This one argues that migrant families are often super optimistic and incredibly motivated, and that amazing drive gets passed down to their kids, who then work extra hard to succeed, sometimes even doing better than their native-born friends. So you've got two theories pointing in completely opposite directions. Okay, so with these two conflicting ideas on the table, let's turn to Russia. I mean, with its massive migrant population, it is the perfect place to test these theories. But what's kind of crazy is that it's been a huge blind spot in the research. Until now.
And when we say massive, we are talking about staggering numbers. Just let this sink in for a second. 11 million. 11 million migrants are living in Russia right now. That's a population bigger than a lot of European countries, all of them navigating a new life.
To put that into perspective, migrants make up almost 8% of Russia's entire population. That is a huge slice of the country, and it makes the question of how their kids are doing in school an absolutely critical national issue.
And yet, for how important this is on a global scale, researchers knew almost nothing about how these millions of kids were actually doing in the classroom. It was just this massive, gaping hole in our understanding. That is, until a really groundbreaking study in 2017 finally decided to get the answer. And this is where the story gets really, really interesting. This research, led by a guy named Edgar Tovar Garcia, set out to finally solve the puzzle. Would Russia look like the rest of the world and have an achievement gap, or would we see that immigrant paradox in action? Now, this study was super thorough. We're talking data from thousands of students tracked over 4 years. So what did they find? A disadvantage like we see almost everywhere else, or that surprising advantage? What do you think? The answer was neither. After all that analysis, all that data, the conclusion was stunningly simple. There is no educational gap between migrant and native students in Russia at all. So let me break down what that really means. Once the researchers statistically controlled for all the other things that can affect school performance, being a migrant on its own had no impact on a student's grades. On average, they performed exactly the same as their native-born classmates. This is a huge, huge finding. I mean, it goes against decades of research in other countries. So if being a migrant isn't the deciding factor for how well a kid does in school in Russia, then what is? Well, it turns out the things that really make a difference are what you might call the usual suspects. How much money a family has, the kind of school a kid goes to, their gender, their age, all of those things had a significant impact on grades. But the one thing everyone expected to matter, migration status, had no effect whatsoever. And it's really important to remember this isn't just a guess. It's based on some seriously heavy-duty analysis of data that followed the same exact students over 4 years.
That method is incredibly powerful, and it let the researchers figure out what truly drives academic success with a ton of confidence. So, the big question is, why? Why is Russia such a total outlier compared to places like the US and Western Europe? Well, the study suggests there are a few really unique things going on.
The answer seems to be buried in Russia's unique history. For one thing, a lot of the migrants aren't foreign in the way we usually think of it. Many are ethnic Russians who are returning from other former Soviet republics. Because of that shared history, they often show up already speaking the language and knowing the culture, which just makes the whole transition way smoother. And on top of that, many migrant groups from places like Central Asia and the Caucasus have an incredibly strong, positive attitude towards education. It all just points to a totally different social dynamic than what we see in the West.
But, and this is a really big but, this surprisingly positive story comes with a major warning label. The researchers are very careful to point out that this amazing educational balance might be super fragile. In fact, the author himself, Tavar Garcia, warns, and I'm quoting here, that a downward assimilation of these migrants might happen in the near future. In other words, this good news story might not last. So why the warning? Well, it's because even if the test scores are equal, the social experience often isn't. The study is very clear that hostility and discrimination against migrants are very real, serious problems in Russia. And the fear is that all these negative social pressures could eventually start to chip away at the incredible resilience these students have shown and end up creating the very achievement gap that, for now, doesn't exist. And that leaves us with the final lingering question. Russia's situation right now is a truly fascinating and unexpected case of educational equality. But as the world keeps changing and migration flows evolve, the real mystery is whether this unique, delicate balance can possibly hold.